So welcome everyone. We are waiting some minutes more for people to join, but I will start to give a short introduction and context about today's webinar. So my name is Daniele Colombaroli, and I will be the moderator of this online webinar, which is hosted by RISC-CAN. It's an abbreviation for Extreme Events and Emergent Risks, and it's one of the knowledge action networks that are part like pages of Future Earth. So for those who are not familiar, PAGES is an international network which coordinates past global change research. You can visit the website and get an idea of ongoing activities and also how you can get involved. And I will pass some links later on in the chat. Oh, I see that already Sarah is adding some links. So there are several working groups in PAGES which are working at the interface between past climates, people, and the environment. For example, I'm one of the leaders of the DiverseK working group, which promotes the integration of paleoecology and indigenous knowledge for pressing question of environmental changes. But there are many other groups dealing with the past interglacial sea level changes, past floods, and also peatlands. So I'll invite you to have a look more closely to the PAGES website. So for today, the goal of this webinar, and as we will hear soon from the speakers, is to introduce you with the RISC-CAN platform and to present the Past for Future working group, which has a paleo perspective and therefore very relevant to many working groups working in PAGES. Okay, so I'd like to introduce first our two speakers. Welcome to Felix Riede. Is a co-chair of RISC-CAN and convener of the working group Past for Future. He works in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. His research focuses on past human-environment interaction, and he has worked extensively on the Lachersee and other past extreme events. Is presently working on his ERC-funded project Clear Arch, which focuses on human adaptations during the last glacial interglacial transition. The second speaker is Phil Riris. He's also convener of the Past for Future working group. Phil is currently lecturer in archaeology and environmental modeling at the Institute for Modeling Socio-Environmental Transition, Bournemouth University. Phil has a particular interest in long-term human dynamics in tropical South America and in quantitative modeling. His current research focuses on the paleodemography of Eastern Brazil. Okay, so before ending this to Felix, I will just remind everyone to mute your microphone, and you can also already post your questions in the chat. So I will then collect all the questions, and then we can go back to the speakers after the presentation. Okay, so I'll hand over to you, Felix, to start.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and for having us here today. I was asked whether I could present the RISC-CAN, which was already mentioned, stands for Knowledge Action Network on Emergent Risks and Extreme Events, and is part of Future Earth, which in turn is affiliated with a range of other relevant scientific and science policy institutions, networks, and conglomerations broadly concerned with the climate and society interface. we have limited time today, but if you want to find out more about DiverseK, I really would encourage you to visit our website, which is stuffed with information and also resources. We have, over the last year or so, especially run a range of webinars, many of which are recorded, so you can find an archive of some of the activities encompassed by DiverseK. But for those of you not familiar with Future Earth, let us take a step back, or maybe rather a step up in the hierarchy here. Future Earth is a global and sort of high-level science policy moderator concerned with bringing research on sustainability to those communities that actually have to deal with climate change challenges on the ground. It is very much concerned with bridging the gap between science and policy. Its mission is to accelerate transformation to global sustainability through research and innovation, seeking a future Earth that where people can thrive sustainably and equitably. It's a network of scientists, researchers, innovators concerned with knowledge transformations towards sustainability, generally working within a systems-based approach, and is made up of ocean researchers, health practitioners, system scientists, and a wide range of people. It has a bunch of hubs distributed around the world. So if you are interested, you can seek out your nearest hub and make contact with them. And Future Earth consists of has a sort of an internal structure that consists of a bunch of what they call global research projects and then knowledge action networks. In earlier phases of Future Earth, these were relatively distinct, but there is a movement currently in the latest restructuring of Future Earth towards a flatter structure, a flatter hierarchy, where these are more or less equal. That said, they are very different beasts. So Pages, for instance, is one of 19 global research projects that are the foundation of Future Earth. But of course, as you know, Pages is an extremely large and very diverse organization in its own right. The same goes for something like iHope, which is a network of scientists also concerned with socio-ecological sustainability that is originally founded on an EU-funded project, but has since evolved into kind of a network of networks. But they're very different in size and scope, although I think there is a very large degree of personnel overlap between a lot of these global research projects and also the knowledge action networks. Technically, however, the knowledge action networks are, in that sense, less concerned with research and more concerned with a kind of translation of that research into action in relation to the solutions for complex societal issues. So if, like myself, you have a solid basis in science, but maybe have gotten interested in how to seek good ways of transforming that science into action, then the knowledge action networks could be an interesting aspect for you to seek out. Our knowledge action network is relatively research heavy and understands itself as an initiative to build a global research network on emergent risks and extreme events in order to address systemic, complex, and cascading risks through a synthesis of various scientific approaches and products, normally within a systems thinking approach, and to provide an open platform for scientific communities from across a variety of disciplines working on extreme events, disaster risk reduction, and governance to exchange information, knowledge, and data. So our Knowledge Action Network contains a variety of interests and expertise covering modeling, complex systems thinking, risk and probability analysis. We have a very heavy sort of data science component in a lot of what we do. There is climate and weather expertise, ecosystem insights, but also health and diversity, and the paleo perspective through our part focus on history, archaeology, and paleoecology. In the longer run, we have already run conference sessions. We organize specific themed sessions at larger conferences such as the EGU. We have regular meetings, teleconferences these days, of course. And eventually, of course, we'd also like to generate joint proposals for new research projects. The RISC-CAN, as it is known for short, itself consists currently of 9 work packages or working groups focused on slightly different aspects concerned with extreme events. You can see them all here. If you go to the website, you can see the manifestos or terms of references for these working groups. You can also get directly in touch with the conveners. These working groups are as active as the conveners make them to be. So I am also being honest with you here. Future Earth itself is a fairly loose organization beyond the Secretariat. And the same, I think, holds true for the RISC-CAN. So it's very much grounded in individual and small group initiatives that think it is important, relevant, and fun to think about these topics here. As was alluded to earlier today, we'd like to focus on the Learning from the Past, or Past for Future working group, which is the one that Phil and I co-convened together with a couple of other colleagues, and which has the most obvious points of contact with pages because of our paleo perspective. But before we get onto that, and before we present some of the research that we're also doing, a bit more about the structure. So we have a development team that sort of steers the RISC-CAN, and a lot of the behind the scenes organization is done by the co-chairs, and that's currently myself and Jana Silman from Cicero in Oslo, and Markus Reichstein, who's the director of the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemical Integration. And it's really thanks to Marcus's initiative, I have to say, that a lot of this is happening because he is interested in it, and that means a lot of secretarial and financial support flows from the Max Planck Institute, where he's based, to some of these activities. So it's a privilege to be able to join a kind of network that has native secretarial support in that sense. You can already see or guess from the names that we have a very diverse, globally diverse development team, and that is even more so true, even more so for the membership composition. So the RISC-CAN, despite its relatively small size, is a truly global organization covering all parts of the world. Our fundamental concern is extreme events. And it differs a little bit within the RISC-CAN, whether this is whether the focus of this is say natural hazards, so geological events effectively that occur independently but in parallel to more processual climate change, or whether you're thinking about climate-driven extreme events that, of course, are becoming both more frequent and more severe as the world is warming. Our fundamental concern and the raison d'etre for why we think extreme events are important is because they endanger the Sustainable Development Goal initiatives. So while sustainable development strengthens societal resilience to extreme events endanger the achievement of many sustainable development goals. And as we actually pointed out in a short Nature commentary published yesterday, thinking about extreme events and heeding them seriously in local, regional, and national climate change adaptation plans is lagging seriously behind. So whilst a lot of good work is done in drafting and implementing climate change adaptation plans at various scales, a lot of them are not designed to withstand the perturbances of extreme events. And that is all the more true so because the complex teleconnections and compound event dynamics that emerge at the interface between climate change, extreme events, and social structures are not fully accounted for. So here, this is just a figure that we drafted for this Nature paper, where we think about some of these complex domino relationships between various kinds of stresses generated here through anthropogenic global warming and eventual down the line societal change. And of course, in a paleo perspective, this framework really actually isn't so foreign, because a lot of folks have thought about major episodes of societal change in relation to what we could within this framework call compound events. So multiple breadbasket failures around prolonged episodes of a drought, for instance, that also then often go hand in hand with erosional events or mudslides as extreme events punctuate these drought episodes, and so on and so on. So there is, as you probably know, a wealth of publications on how past societies have dealt or failed to deal with similar kinds of events in the past. And our concern in the Past for Future working group is really trying to revisit some of these or find new ones and frame them within a study designs that make them amenable to better dialogue with policymakers and scientists concerned with the present. And this is quite acute because in this recent analysis of conceptual differences between various relevant disciplines, McPhillips et al. Found that the social sciences are really still very far apart from a lot of the other relevant disciplines. So a lot of bridge building still needs to be done. And I think institutions such as Pages, but also our working group, are really well positioned to function as translators between these important contributing disciplines. And another important translation that needs to be done is between the sciences and the policymakers. And I would really recommend you have a quick look at this really interesting paper that actually it was generated by a Future Earth initiative. They designed a survey that was sent to Future Earth scientists in parallel to the survey that is done at the World Economic Forum. So with economic and policy leaders, asking them to rate various kinds of threats to global stability. And the figure you see here shows the results for these surveys for these two survey populations, and there are significant differences. And generally, the scientists rate the risk of, say, extreme event and climate change as much higher than the policymakers. So there is still an important and widely underappreciated gap in the way that scientists and policymakers see global risk. And that is independent of, again, the complex causal relationships where climate change or some other kinds of disturbance factor can lead to a societal change through, for example, in this instance, a social amplification of risk. And just to highlight the kinds, that was sort of the general part related to the Future Earth and to our Past for Future working group. So let me just say again, and I will say it again at the end of the presentation, if you are interested, make sure you sign up for the newsletter, or you send me an email. We can link you up with the organization. You can easily become involved as much as you like if you are interested. So far for the first half of our presentation, I will now give the word over to Phil, who will present some of his work on paleodemographic perspectives on climate extremes and resilience from the neotropics. And then I'll take over again, talking about some of the work we've been doing on the extreme event, namely the Lhasa eruption, and how that has impacted past peoples in tandem with contemporaneous climate change, and also how we can make such work relevant in the present. So with that, I will hand over to you, Phil. And you'll just give me a shout when you want the slides to change. All right?
Yeah, we'll do it old school. Thanks, Felix. If you could just go on to my first slide. So I know we've heard a lot about different organizations and institutes and networks that that exist out there focused on the study of past human environmental interaction, both in the past and present and looking forward. But I should still nonetheless do a little plug for my own institute, the Institute for Modeling Socio-Environmental Transitions at the University of Bournemouth. We were only established last year under Bournemouth University strategic investment area in sustainability. And we're a team of archaeologists, paleoecologists, and ecologists who are focused on taking the information gained from studying the past and using it to help inform contemporary and future climate change adaptation strategies. And as part of this, we are aiming to create a global collaborative research network that we hope to grow significantly over time. Our social media and email is there. And if you're interested in knowing more, I encourage you to give us a follow and get in touch. But the main thrust of what I want to talk to you about today, next slide, please, Felix. Has that moved on? Yeah. Is paleodemographic perspectives on past resilience. Now, this is the angle from which I come to the study of past extreme events. Through their understanding and measuring their consequences for societies in terms of their effects on population and the many ways in which societies can construct resilience. And I should just draw your attention to this recent special issue of Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of Biological Sciences that came out earlier this year. It was published online in late 2020, which has come out of an ongoing workshop series called Cross-Disciplinary Approaches to Prehistoric Demography. And the latest iteration of this workshop was actually hosted by Felix in Aarhus. Paleodemography is necessarily, if you want to know more, I encourage you to read our editorial, but just sort of sum it up, paleodemography is necessarily a combination of different sources and methods and theories, drawing from bioarchaeology and bioanthropology, ancient DNA and genomic reconstruction, settlement data, material culture, and quite prominently radiocarbon databases, large databases of anthropogenic radiocarbon, which is what I'll mainly be talking about today. This is what my work focuses on. And a particular focus of paleodemographic studies as a whole, if you like, is to align or at least compare paleoenvironmental, paleoclimatic, paleoecological proxies with past population data constructed through these diverse sources of information. And I think my take-home message today, if I can be said to have one, is that one way, or perhaps the best way to achieve this goal of aligning paleoenvironmental and paleosocietal data is to take a page out of the book of people who have been doing this for much longer than us, ecologists, resilience theorists, and actually moving towards quantification of key resilience parameters such as net change, resistance, recovery in an ancient context, and bring more rigor to this process. But also that recognizing that this represents a challenge of a different scope and scale than is typically understood in the neo-ecological literature. So when we're talking about millennial scale or centennial scale change, it brings its own challenges. Next slide, please, Felix. So in this brief talk, I'll walk you through where I've been with these issues and perhaps a bit ambitiously where I'd like to go. So the first half of my slides here will be talking about some published research out in scientific reports a couple of years ago entitled Widespread Population Decline in South America Correlates with Mid-Holocene Climate Change. And the motivation for this research was this pervasive pattern across South America, geographically and spatially transgressive phenomenon of population downturn. In Brazil, in central Brazil, it's called the Archaic Gap. In the South Central Andes, they call it regional abandonment, discontinuities in the Amazon, temporal troughs in the Argentine Pampas, Argentine and Uruguayan Pampas, etc., etc. And we wanted to understand this pattern on a continental scale through the use of a large database of radiocarbon dates collected in part by us, but also by other practitioners in this area. And for those of you who don't know, the use of aggregated radiocarbon dates, so aggregating them through summing their probability distributions, of calibrated radiocarbon dates produces something that is actually quite rare in archaeological research, and that's a continuous time series that is actually a fairly rare thing to have. And in many regards, this is now this proxy for this radiometric proxy is understood to in some way through various stages of filtering and loss and transformation to indicate relative population change over time. That's the main conceit, if you like, of much paleodemographic research that works with radiocarbon data. So this is what we used for our population proxy. We also employed 6 high-resolution hydroclimatic records with sufficient latitudinal coverage to detect potential variability in hydroclimate over the entire continent. So from north to south, there's Cariaco, Tigre Petido, Yanacocha, Lapagrange, Botuverá, and Potrocaique in the south there. And these kind of provide a latitudinal cross-section, if you like, of the continent. And our main hypothesis was that the downturn that we see in the mid-Holocene, so from about 8.2 Ka years onward, is connected to disruptions of the hydroclimate connected to freshwater forcing. For those of you who don't know, most of the precipitation, especially over tropical South America, is teleconnected to the North Atlantic. So any perturbations in the North Atlantic, whether that be sea surface temperature or otherwise, is likely to have impacts on the levels and distribution of precipitation across the South American tropics. Next slide, please, Felix. So, just to cut to the chase, encourage you to read the paper if you have any further questions. We detected statistically significant decline against best fit growth models, population change models, between 8.2 thousand years ago and especially after 7,900 calibrated years before present, until about 6,000, until about the middle of the mid-Holocene. Now, we didn't just pull this out of our hat. We iterated through tons and tons of models, about 120 different candidate models, I think. And alongside our paleodemographic proxy, we performed outlier analysis on our hydroclimate proxies, which show these 2 phases of really high variability relative to the Holocene average, starting around 8,300 years ago. And the strongest, in the lower half of the slide, the strongest negative regional demographic patterns correlate to the areas affected areas most heavily influenced by the position and strength of the intertropical convergence zone. In other words, the areas highlighted in yellow there. That's winter and summer precipitation, and this is an index of a spatial index of variance across the mid-Holocene. And our interpretation is that demographic patterns were basically driven by hydroclimatic variability over the early to mid-Holocene transition. And to sum up, if you go to the next slide, Felix, the mid-Holocene in South America is an exciting time in general from an archaeological perspective. It's when we see, for example, the emergence of polyculture agroforestry in Amazonia, the long-distance dispersal of maize and manioc, for instance, two main tropical staples, the intensification of land use and the emergence of place use redundancy, and at the very tail end of the mid-Holocene, the emergence of the first forms of ceremonial and communal architecture. So while the domestication and/or management of plant food resources was already underway in the early Holocene, the sort of fixation as part of our diversified and therefore potentially resilient subsistence system likely took place during the mid-Holocene, in this phase of high hydroclimatic variability. This has been, in the paleobotanical literature, this has been hypothesized for a relatively long time. But it is gratifying that more and more studies, empirical studies, rather than sort of meta studies like we did, are demonstrating this with empirical data, such as this recent paper in Quaternary by Laura Furquim and colleagues, facing change through diversity, resilience, and diversification of plant management strategies during the mid to late Holocene transition. I find it interesting that hydroclimate anomalies of unusual frequency and amplitude are perhaps more relevant to understanding these kinds of transitions on a continental scale than extreme arid or pluvial or humid events in an absolute sense. It's the amplitude and frequency of hydroclimate events rather than it being drier or wetter, in other words. So of course, when talking about ancient socio-ecological systems on this scale, this will naturally be quite coarse and generalized. And thinking through this, there's nothing intrinsic to either climatic variability. Our species has endured oscillations of a far greater magnitude for example, during the Pleistocene, during the late Pleistocene. So there's nothing intrinsic to either climate variability, domesticates, or indeed South America itself that means the patterns we observe will necessarily have arisen. They are contingent outcomes of complex interactions, and to understand them better, I think it's a good idea to look at more specific case studies, which if we go on to the next slide, I'm just becoming conscious of time. So yeah, tests of this prediction, this kind of broad level prediction that we produce, need recourse to specific examples, and that's what my present research is on in the Atlantic forests of eastern Brazil. Now, it is increasingly accepted in conservation circles that the deep time perspectives on forest dynamics and human occupation and tropical landscape modification are essential in order to develop a more effective and inclusive protection strategy and policy towards them in the 21st century. Even local and regional scale impacts on tropical forests can have significant Earth system feedbacks down the line as part. And this has its roots in prehistory, certainly in the Atlantic forest. But the Atlantic forest has also been relatively neglected in this regard, with virtually no studies addressing the linkages between the extent of change and late Holocene climate impacts, or disentangling potential human versus climatic drivers of change at the biome scale. We're talking about the biome scale here, running from northeastern Brazil almost down south to Uruguay. This is despite the fact that the Atlantic forest of East and South America hosts one of the longest records of human occupation on the continent. And so from early Holocene foragers who produced an unusual diversity of stone tool technologies corresponding to the use of different ecological niches, all the way to complex multi-ethnic mosaics of farming societies by the time of European conquest. The archaeology of the Atlantic forest really does indicate sort of sustained and widespread forms of different socio-ecological feedbacks across this region. Now, due to large-scale forest deforestation beginning with pretty much the dawn of conquest, they are also one of the most threatened biotic domains of Latin America, with an estimated removal rate of at least sort of 70% in the last 500 years. Conversely, major expansions of highland forests during the late Holocene is at least in part a product of human intervention, human propagation, in concert with of course favorable climatic conditions, with increasing wetness over this cline. Nonetheless, we witness intensifying occupations of especially river valleys and particular parts of the southern highlands, which generated their own distinctive environmental footprints in the form of enriched soils and associated managed biota, especially economically valuable species. So myself and my collaborator, Jonas Gregorio de Souza, who's at the University of Barcelona, we are bringing together radiocarbon and cultural data for the entire Atlantic forest for the first time. We're using simulated and empirical environmental data to contextualize centennial to millennial scale demographic and adaptational shifts, and hopefully break down some regional differences in paleo-demographic trajectories to understand long-term socio-ecological feedbacks, and extreme events are part of this. Next slide, please. Again, I'm conscious of time, so I just want to flag some previous work in southern Brazil and on the Atlantic coast, which was just published in January in the Journal of Archaeological Science, led by Jonas. Our results confirm basically that, as in other parts of the American continent, we have a delayed demographic transition observed between the initial adoption of crops and sustained population growth. And we further demonstrate that in the sort of the southernmost extreme of the Atlantic forest, demographic trends are regionally asynchronous and often anti-phase, in fact, between different regions, depending on land use and subsistence base. We are carrying this work forward across the entire domain of the Atlantic forest, the area highlighted in the solid circle there, with new model fitting and selection techniques using Bayesian inference. So we have identified this sort of sustained negative or stationary trend before around 2000 BP, calibrated years before present, followed by a significantly different and sustained phase of population growth after this point in time. Now, one reason to prefer model fitting with Bayesian priors is that in the converse approach, and the sort of frequentist, almost traditional approach, with enough dates, it becomes trivial to reject sort of a least squares fitted model, and they don't adequately control for the sample size of the radiocarbon dates, etc., etc. Other things I don't have time to go into today, but it allows us to refocus our paleodemographic analysis on parameters of interest, growth rates, and different phasings. Next slide, please. So preliminarily, what we're seeing is, looking at the sort of the number one there is the regional breakdown of different growth rates, with the gray envelope being a null hypothesis of no differences between regions. There are distinct differences between different biogeographical regions of the Atlantic forest, embedded in an overall pattern of exponential growth during the last 1500 years before contact. I won't go into them just now because for time reasons, but essentially what we're looking at is during the only deviations from our kind of null model of no regional differences occurred during the medieval warm period, or the medieval climatic anomaly. Now, whether these patterns represent different responses to climate events, as some have suggested, this is something that we're actively looking into, and is sort of very in the early and very rough stages of research. But particular challenges are discerning these kind of lead and lag dynamics, and whether climate events are indeed resolved in cultural records at all. But I think this kind of approach is our best guess at doing so. And what is interesting, I think, is to try and compare and juxtapose the sort of core scale ecological and cultural trajectories, again, here from north to south, with on that map, the blue representing biome stability, while red is change over each time step in the Holocene. These are millennial scale times, 4 millennial scale time steps from 4000 BP to present. And what we are seeing, that despite largely sustained population growth until, particularly in the south and particularly in the final couple of millennia before the European conquest, is a large maintenance of forest cover, while in the central corridor and the narrow northeastern strip of Atlantic forest is greater instability. Now, it's interesting to view that in light of the kinds of social systems and emergent hierarchies that we see emerging in southern Brazil, when in this kind of stable band in the south. But these biome distribution estimates are based purely on hindcasts of climate models, although they're calibrated with reference to pollen records. And so they have ample space for ground truthing and testing. And ideally, what we would hope to do is eventually go out into the field and core some of these predicted unstable, quote unquote, locations, conduct archaeological surveys alongside, and ultimately obtain decent coverage of cultural activity over the long term, where possible, to gauge the effect, if any, of events such as the medieval climate anomaly. Next slide, please. This is my final one. So what, basically? There's tropical forests are they're universally recognized as crucial for climate regulation and landscape stability. And large-scale deforestation, of course, has significant feedbacks on the carbon cycle. Extensive forested vegetation contributes to generating regional precipitation patterns, meaning Atlantic forest cover expansion at the expense of grasslands during the Holocene likely had positive feedbacks on precipitation, while aerosol forcing through alterations to terrestrial temperature gradients also has knock-on effects on the strength of the monsoon. What's interesting from my perspective as an archaeologist is that most climate models actually lack any data on pre-industrial land use that may have influenced these dynamics, demonstrably biasing forecasts of future change. And so I think one thing that archaeology can contribute in this regard is to sort of start accounting for pre-industrial human influences and ending this sort of perpetual sort of use of pristine ecosystems in climate modeling. The recognition of pre-Columbian activity as an important landscape process, I think, also invites reconsideration of the scales and thresholds that define the boundary of the Anthropocene, which mainly considers modern human impacts as valid markers of change. And I think I'll just leave it there. We kind of diverged a little bit from the extreme events focus, but I do have more to say, but I think I'll hand over to Felix in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Phil. Let's quickly move on to our case study. In the meantime, perhaps, Phil, you can just review the stuff that's come up in the chat. There are a couple of questions for you there. So some of my work over the last 10 odd years or so has been concerned with the rather large volcanic eruption of the so-called Lachasee in Western Germany and its impact on plants, animals, and humans at the time. Rated on the often used volcanic explosivity index, a kind of scale akin to the Richter scale for volcanic eruptions, the Lachasee eruption, which occurred 13,000 years ago, ranks in on a 6, so large, but by no means a kind of super eruption or something out of the entirely ordinary. Volcanologists have calculated that the likelihood of a VEI 6 eruption in our current century is 100%. So eruptions like these do occur at timescales above electoral cycles, but certainly within graspable historical timescales. The Lachersee is currently an infilled crater rest located in a lovely area of Germany with great beer and wine. So there's also a camping ground nearby. If you do get a chance, go and visit. But 13,000 years ago, this location was the site of a true and truly destructive spectacle. Due to interaction with groundwater as the crater was reamed out by the rising magma, we see the evidence for phreatomagmatic eruption, so interaction between water and the rising magma being extremely explosive. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Northern Hemisphere in the late Pleistocene. The ash column has been reconstructed to have been perhaps as high as 40 kilometers into the atmosphere, so well above cloud levels and really exceptionally high. A total of at least 20 cubic kilometers of volcanic ejecta left the Earth at that time, and more than 1,400 square kilometers of the near-vent area was entirely covered in volcanic ejecta up to 60 meters thickness. Here you see one of the really wonderful exposures of the stratigraphy from this eruption. This is a much younger but not much smaller me, so for scale, and this basically these are layers resulting from a single eruption, and they go down to 50-60 meters thickness. The volcano is located really closely to the River Rhine, Europe's third largest and economically most important river. The eruption dammed the river right here at a particular narrow spot just beyond the so-called Neuwied Basin, which was quickly filled by water, causing widespread upstream flooding well beyond the immediate area. So here you see a reconstruction of the flooded area, especially here in the upper Rhine-Graben, where the basin really flattens out. You see really a massive flooding. So this event, of course, also then dried out the lower Rhine basin for some time, although already during or shortly after the eruption, this dam broke, sending a massive, dirty river flood wave, something like this, down the then dry lower Rhine area. There is evidence for such fluvial deposited tephra all the way into the English Channel and all along the lower Rhine. So massive amounts of dirty water, extremely destructive. Is one of the most serious secondary hazards associated with contemporary volcanic eruptions, raced down the lower Rhine area during this time. This eruption was no doubt catastrophic for local flora and fauna, but of course, for paleoscientists, much like at Pompeii and other similar situations, this was a real boon. So this late Ice Age landscape was covered and thereby sealed by a thick layer of volcanic deposits, which are economically very valuable. So they're being mined regularly in the area, and over time have revealed a remarkable record of this late Pleistocene landscape. So we have burned woodlands and a plethora of macrobotanical remains of all sorts, which has allowed the very precise dating, and more work is ongoing. I see Michael is in the audience also here. More work is ongoing on yet refining this. But this has facilitated a very precise positioning of the eruption, both on a calendrical time scale, but also in relation to seasons. So we know that this occurred 13,000 years ago, plus minus just a few years, in late spring, early summer. There are also animal tracks in the ash of various animals that used lull phases in the eruption to crisscross the wet ash. And excavations have revealed a range of archaeological sites of all sizes. And I think that's really exciting because, of course, some of these are very big and quite famous, but we also have some of the tiny sites that we normally never find, the sort of single fireplace and handful of tools, revealing a complex strategies of land use with a hierarchy of different settlement sites. Interestingly, however, most recent work in dating these sites indicates that that the landscape was relatively thinly occupied by humans immediately before the eruption. So, and I'll return to this later. A total of over 300,000 square kilometers was affected directly by ashfall. And the most distal records we have, some by proxy, but others by actual finds of volcanic tephra from this eruption, are as far away as 1,100 kilometers to the northeast and some 500 kilometers to the south. Here's some pictures of the animal footprints and some of the archaeological remains. So over the last 10 years or so, I've spent an inordinate amount of time collating this database of all known tephra occurrences in the last a lot of this comes from legacy resources that is really from a variety of disciplines. So it's been a really interesting and complex journey into a diverse and on the whole really not very well accessible literature. But nonetheless, you see these black dots. These are probably airfall deposits, and there are also a bunch of black triangles. These are fluvial deposits, and they fundamentally mark the course of the Rhine River down here. The sites that are marked by white rings are archaeological sites where we have a direct stratigraphic relationship between late Pleistocene archaeology and Lhasa tephra, and with a single exception. We have a stratigraphic sequence that goes from human occupation, then tephra, and then no occupation until much later in time. The concentric circles you see here are standard divisions into a proximal, medial, distal, and ultradistal area, and they allow us to think conceptually about what sort of effects, what sort of secondary mechanisms may have affected plants, animals, and humans most intensely as we move away from the eruptive center, and as the impacts of the eruption on the landscape changes with that. Let me also remind you, although most of you of course know this, that we're not talking about regular ash that falls as part of such an eruption, but tephra, exploded rock, often sharp-edged, most commonly loaded with a bunch of chemicals, some of which are quite dangerous. It's very light because it's filled with gases, and it can remain in the landscape for a very long time indeed. It's also quite interesting and actually quite revealing to think about how this eruption was perceived by people at the time. So for instance, in this very well studied proximal sequence, there is one layer, the Big Bang layer, named by volcanologists, not by myself, which is sort of related to one of the initial crater collapses and the interaction with groundwater, and where the crater then afterwards becomes very much bigger. And thinking about just how this eruption sounded and how it was perceived and experienced by people at the time. I mean, these explosions lasting probably for weeks or months would have been heard over the whole of Europe. And we know from recent eruption that this generates a lot of stress, anxiety, and other kinds of socio-psychological disorders. Volcanic eruptions also go hand in hand with a variety of other secondary effects. Volcanic lightning, of course, the covering of landscape. You can quantify roughly how much ash fell at a given location, and we've looked at that, and we've looked at also at the resulting darkness that is generated by the ash cloud. And again, darkness is one of these factors that closely relates to anxiety and social change, political instability, and so on. We know this from the ethnographic record. So there's a variety of impact dynamics, most of which we have studied. There is at least one paper relating to each of these sort of aspects, like increased dental abrasion in animals and humans following tephra deposition, the respiratory health hazard of the very fine-grained ash, especially in the distal zone. We've looked at potential hazards of fluoride poisoning following the eruption, as well as disruptions to migration pathways and social networks at the time, all coming together to generate these human impact down the line human impacts as they documented the archaeological record. But I also want to highlight some of the more sort of systematic conceptual work we've been doing. So looking more comparatively at how volcanic eruptions, not only in this case, but in many other cases, have impacted human societies in the present and the past. And from this, we have, and using the La Hazé as a kind of paradigm case study, we've derived a sort of systematic for understanding past volcanic eruptions in a hypothesis-driven framework. So we know that volcanic eruptions, especially explosive ones, have a range of primary and secondary effects, and they have a spatial and chronological kind of specific signature. So in principle, we can now go to other eruptions and take this kind of scheme and then apply it in terms of generating specific hypotheses about specific effects that we can then go and test using both tephra samples, other geoarchaeological methods, paleoecological records, and of course, what you call paleosocietal records, that is the archaeological material. One of our points, of course, is also that oftentimes it is the societies not directly affected by the ash, but in regions immediately adjacent to them that are most heavily affected, as animals, people are pushed away from the directly affected areas. So migration is a clear linking factor in these impacts. Some of our most recent work, which I also want to flag up in a specific context because it was generated as part of the PAGE's working group, VIC's working group, Volcanic Impacts on Climate and Society, which is really a fantastic, enjoyable initiative. We've done some new climate models together with colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg, where we use the paleo case of the La Hazé eruption. So what we know about the tephra distribution at the time, for instance, to nudge models for a recurring eruption in the present. So we were looking for specific meteorological conditions in climate model runs that would allow us to mimic a similar kind of eruption, given what we know about the timing and the tephra deposition from the late Pleistocene eruption. And then we explored in these models, using a range, a small ensemble range, what the climatic perturbations of such an eruption would be in the present. And future work in this line, of course, would then also project this into the future using climate models that integrate anthropogenic warming as projected into the next decades and centuries. What we found, though, just to wrap this aspect up, is that the climatic impact of this eruption was probably quite small. So climate perturbations of such an extreme event alone are unlikely to be the main explanatory factor for the kind of archaeological changes that we see. So instead, we need to think about climate, but also ecosystem service impacts through tephra deposition, as well as social amplification of risks through network effects coming together to generate the kind of paleodemographic and cultural effects that we see. And what is it that we see? Well, we see fundamentally a depopulation of the area towards the northeast of the eruption. This is where the ash fell most thickly, and radiocarbon dates and stratigraphies tend to indicate that people may have left or almost left this area. This corresponds effectively to present-day parts of central Germany. But also that in southern Scandinavia, so just to the side of the main tephra deposition lobe, we see a kind of effervescence of a new or slightly different cultural phenomenon, the so-called Bromme culture, which is characterized by a very tight regional circumscription, but also some would argue by the loss of technological complexity. So we see the archaeological record indicating a kind of dropping out of bow and arrow technology. The effects leading to this were probably quite complex. We can go into that later, or you can read the papers if you like. And as part of a large project funded by the Danish Research Council over the last 5 years, we've been thinking hard about making this kind of paleoscience relevant in a contemporary context. So, and one is through what is called realistic disaster scenarios. And the insurance policy industry and also some governments have been working with this in terms of drafting scenarios for future extreme events grounded in past events. And what our argument is here, that we can take these natural experiments of the past, so particular case studies that each have their own timeline from past to punctuated extreme event to their future. We can take these, and even though the societies would always been very different to the present, comparatively, we can generate insights about different socio-ecological pathways following a particular disturbance. Okay, and this goes in front. It's true for the near future, but also kind of the deep future. We've also identified museums as major allies in bringing this kind of information to the public. A lot of research has been focusing on what role museums can play in climate change adaptation, and they have a big role to play. And as paleoscientists, we are really fortunate to have a ready-made museum infrastructure of both museums of natural history and museums of cultural history that can help us in bringing our insights and our science to public and creating democratic debate around these. Furthermore, we have developed an evidence-based publication strategy for targeting the right journals to write to if you want your work to be read by the IPCC community, for instance. So that's published in Global Environmental Change, and you see a list there of the right journals to go for if you want to have that kind of policy impact. So finally, let me just alert you to a couple of upcoming DiverseK and especially Past for Future activities. We have a bunch of EGU sessions, 2 actually, so you can join those. We have a call for papers opened in Frontiers in Science on extreme events in human evolution from the Pleistocene to, well, the Anthropocene. That's kind of missing there, but you get the gist. And also a call for papers for a special issue in Environmental Research Letters on Earth system resilience and tipping behavior. And finally, check out our website or also the DiverseK webpage for upcoming webinars and for the Past for Future activities, the DiverseK activities, which are closely related, and also the other working group webinars, which are very active, some of which are very active on this front. And with that, and 2 minutes after the hour, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Phil and Felix. There are already some questions and discussion going on in the chat. So I just pick some of those. There are some questions for Phil related to its methodology and the extent to which this can be, applied over different regions and time scales. And then there is also a question about the relationship between paleodemography and economics, if you can address those shortly.
Yeah, so I replied in chat, but for those who haven't checked the chat, yeah, so the use of radiocarbon dates is near universal in archaeological paleodemographic studies, and I've put some links to our special issue in Philosophical Transactions B in the chat, as well as some more sort of classic or sort of general overview studies explaining the use of this proxy. This is a proxy, and sort of the theoretical underpinnings of the use of radiocarbon dates. As regards if Althea wants to unmute or turn her camera on, I'd be interested in hearing more about what exactly you meant with your question.
Okay, sorry. It just got me thinking, because Felix, you presented that image from the paper, just showing how differently policymakers and scientists think about, or how they prioritize things like extreme events. And it just got me thinking. I've worked a bit with environmental economists, and that whole idea of rational responses to stresses. And I just thought that the past shows how complex and as you said, contingent that was. So I just thought it would be interesting to know if any economists had been involved in just hearing about your work. Just curious about how they might respond on and think about that in terms of the implications, maybe like the scenarios that you're developing?
So, like I said, I'm not aware of any economists being involved directly with work in this way, but obviously a lot of our rationale and reasoning is occasionally underpinned by things like, you know, minimizing risks and things like that, diversification. I don't know if you know of anything, Felix, in this vein, because personally it's not a collaboration I've ever seen.
I mean, they're interesting to talk to. I don't personally do it very much, but there are people in the RISC-CAN who work very closely with this kind of economic modeling. And I'm putting a report here in the chat, especially this guy Halligat. He's been doing a lot of work on, you know, hardcore economic modeling, looking at the returns on even moderate investments into extreme event resilience, and they universally show that it pays off, right? At timescales, of course, beyond electoral cycles, but definitely to the benefit of society. So there are some economists, also a guy called Ilan Noy in New Zealand, who really have presented a robust framework in which this makes total economic sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm waiting to see if there are other questions in the chat. Maybe I have one question for you, Felix, related to extreme events and risks. So part of the work on risks and extreme events is challenged with this question about their predictability for the future. So my question is, are there any initiatives within this platform that can possibly address more on this? For example, looking at early warning signals.
Definitely, yes. There is a whole working group within the RISC-CAN dedicated to early warning. It's a particular concern of those who work on climate-related extreme events, because they can potentially be better predicted than geological extreme events. But part of the answer here I think should also be that the predictability is in many ways independent on the focus on resilience and mitigation. Because if we understand the component of the total system that is the social resilience, the social system, then generating resilience there often cuts across different sort of extreme event perturbations, or even regular climate change, or even other kinds of technological disasters. So if you can make that part of the equation more robust, then you're actually generating a system that is more robust independently of when and what kind of extreme event happens.
Thanks. Indeed, a challenge for future research. So I'm looking if there are other questions. Otherwise, I have another question, maybe for both. One of the also challenge is the way we address policymakers' questions, and much of the challenges rely on the way we can make our research more understandable, and in other ways we can find a common language in order to have our research having an impact also on this front. What are the actions or initiatives or approaches taken by you on this front? This is a question also that is relevant for many pages working group working on this front too.
Yeah, I mean, here Future Earth, I think, is really active, and that relates to the way they have set up a sort of upscaling hierarchy, right? So the Secretariat which actually is run by a bunch of full-time employees, they really are concerned with talking to policymakers, developing formats, white papers, reports, that kind of thing, in a language that is accessible and reaches out to policymakers. So the events that Future Earth as such stages are really aimed at precisely that. And then what goes underneath, what goes underneath is more the generation of scientific insights. But it also varies quite a lot between the different parts. I mean, our RISCAN is actually quite research heavy. Others are much more applied. So they link then up to the actions in the Secretariat, which in turn links to the policymakers. It's a long and hard slog, as you know, but that is the way that Future Earth operates, and it really targets very high-level policymaking as well.
Thanks. That's indeed something that we all should work on it together.
Definitely.
Okay, so I think we are approaching the end of this webinar. I would like to thank first the two speakers, Phil and Felix. This was really a great overview, also to think about the range of different applications and how we can make it together relevant. And then I want to thank Pages for promoting this event. This is very much of importance for collaborative work also across different working groups. And there are a lot of potential overlaps which can lead to future collaboration.